You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up, are we on the brink of a new coal mine in Britain, the first in decades? 5 more years for Emmanuel Macron, but will he get France's climate commitments on track? Small behavioural changes that will save money on your energy bills and reduce carbon emissions. And meat made in space, but can lab-grown meat ever take off? Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show where we track the changes happening to our world, hear from the people being hit hardest by those changes and report on the race for solutions. Now, a deadline by which the government should decide whether or not to approve a new coal mine in Cumbria is fast approaching. Whitehaven Mine, to exploit coking coal for industrial use, would be the first new coal mine to open in this country for more than 30 years. And, according to newspaper reports, the government is leaning towards approving the new site. Its supporters say it would prove invaluable in reducing reliance on Russian coal, it would provide hundreds of local jobs, and that producing coal in the UK would be better for the climate than importing it. Well, with me is our climate reporter, Victoria Seabrook. So, Victoria, those are the arguments put forward by its supporters, but there are a lot of people who oppose this new coal mine, aren't there?
Yes, that's right. So bear in mind that this coal is going to be used in steel production, which needs a lot of coal. It's very energy intensive. Let's just take all of those 3 points that you made in turn. So first of all, in terms of getting off Russian coal, last year the UK did get a lot of this kind of coal from Russia, around 40%. But actually, since Russia invaded Ukraine, the British steel industry has already managed to ditch imports of this kind of Russian coal and get it from elsewhere, mainly Australia and North America. Then in terms of jobs, West Cumbria Mining says this will create 500 jobs. 400 of those would be local, quite a lot of them would be underground, and there are some questions about how desirable these kinds of jobs are, given that this is a declining industry and isn't going to be around all that much longer if the UK is to meet its climate targets. And then crucially, on the climate and emissions front, there is an argument that, of course, producing this kind of coal domestically lowers emissions in comparison with shipping it in from the other side of the world, potentially. But West Cumbria Mining, the company behind this project, says that something like 87% of this coal is going to be exported anyway. It's going to be sold on international markets. And the government's climate advisors, the Climate Change Committee, has warned that this mine would have an appreciable impact on the UK's own emissions targets. And then finally, it's just worth remembering that the UK, when it hosted COP26, the big climate summit in Glasgow last year, it went around the world lobbying other countries, trying to persuade them to give up coal and ditch it. So it's quite hard to see how it would reconcile having lobbied other countries to do that and then potentially going ahead and approving a new coal mine here in the UK.
Victoria, thank you. Emmanuel Macron has won a second term as President of France, promising voters that his new Prime Minister will take personal charge of the environment brief. Climate change didn't play a big role in the campaign, but it was top of the list of voters' concerns alongside the cost of living. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, reports from Paris.
I think there are reasons to be sceptical, if not cynical, about Emmanuel Macron's climate change credentials. A French court recently ruled that France, under his presidency, has not done enough to meet its mandated climate change goals, and he only really came to the issue in the last week of the campaign when he promised to build 15 new nuclear power stations and 50 wind farms. Having said all that, Marine Le Pen, his rival, would have been a lot worse for the environment and for climate, because she didn't seem to have much time for the issue in her campaign, only really talked about it in terms of her opposition to the international free trade system. And she, like Donald Trump on the other side of the Atlantic, has a pet peeve about wind farms. I think the question about Emmanuel Macron that particularly young French voters want answered is, has he seen the light? Is he convinced enough about the cause of climate change to put his full weight behind it? Not just in France, but also in Europe. He's undoubtedly going to have a powerful position in Europe now that he's been re-elected, and with the German Chancellor distracted by things like Ukraine and Russian gas. He has a position to make a huge difference in France and in Europe. But I think French voters are sceptical because he's seen as coming from an industrialist, banking background. He's seen as elitist. So they need to be convinced that he has seen the light, and I think they think the jury is still out. He's got a lot of convincing to do.
Let's get some of the day's other climate news now. And a new poll has found that the Conservatives would lose 2 in 5 2019 voters if the party ditched net zero plans. The results, published by the think tank Onward, found that the net zero policy, which commits the government to huge reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, is deemed so important that 58% of people would pay more to reach the UK's 2050 target. A further 68% of people polled said that the UK should move faster towards net zero and restrict Russian gas exports, even if it makes bills more expensive. Greenpeace activists have today blocked a tanker from delivering Russian oil to Norway. Protesters chained themselves to the vessel's anchor chain in Slagen oil terminal as they attempted to prevent the offloading of 95,000 tonnes of oil. The group is calling for the Norwegian government to ban imports of Russian fossil fuels following the invasion of Ukraine. Wildfires have been sweeping through the west and southwest of the United States as dry and windy conditions have created a dangerously early fire season. Arizona, New Mexico and Colorado have been battling to contain fires across different parts of the states, which have left at least one person dead and destroyed hundreds of structures. Rising temperatures attributed to climate change are prolonging fire seasons and making blazes more intense. Now, energy bills are rocketing. The price cap went up by around 50% at the start of this month and looks set to increase again in October. Now, we've talked a lot about measures that homeowners can take to reduce those bills and the resulting carbon emissions. But those tend to cost a lot of money: solar panels, heat pumps and insulation. But there are behavioural changes that we can all make which would save both money and emissions. So if we take a look at this chart, the huge majority of our energy is being used for heating. Now, that's where the majority of our savings would then come from. And you can see clearly here that more than 2/3 of the country's annual gas consumption happens between November and February. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the top behavioural change would be turning down the thermostat by 2 degrees, and that could save the average household more than £200. And of course, turning it down by just 1 degree would save more than £100. But electricity is still much more expensive than gas. So activities like not using a tumble dryer, putting your fridge in a cool place and installing a water-efficient shower head could save us all money and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So in total, this is the amount of gas that we use in this country. And those top 5 behavioural changes could save up to 1/6 of total gas consumption. That's the area there in blue, the savings. Well, Jason Palmer is Director of Cambridge Architectural Research and Cambridge Energy and conducted the original research a decade ago on which our updated charts are based. So the first question to you, I guess, Jason, is, has very much changed in the past 10 years in terms of advice?
So the advice hasn't changed a huge amount, no. We would still give very similar recommendations. And what people can do today is actually very simple, very similar to the kind of actions that we were recommending back in 2012. But what has changed in the meantime is a number of things. First of all, the number of households has increased. So there's getting on for 1.2 million more homes, more households now than there were in 2012. The weather is a little bit milder in winter than it was then. Homes are a little better insulated than they were back then. They're also better controlled. So heating systems now are slightly better controlled than they were back in 2012. It's more common now to have room thermostats and timers being used. More common to have thermostatic radiator valves, TRVs, controlling the temperature of individual radiators, which wasn't so common back in 2012. But as I say, overall, the advice that we give today is remarkably similar to the way it was in 2012. One other significant change is the shift from incandescent, from old-style light bulbs. that weren't using tungsten, switching over to either complex fluorescence or in some cases LEDs. And that meant a big saving on electricity consumption over that period.
Oh, that's really interesting. And the behavioural changes that you've put forward are very simple, as we said. But longer term, are people actually going to have to spend more money if they're going to make a real difference to their energy production and by extension to emissions as well? They're going to have to invest in solar panels or heat pumps, for example.
Yes, so you're right. There's a range of different actions people can take, from the very low-cost actions that we looked at in our report on behaviours, through to medium-cost upgrades, things like changing heating controls, so improving, making sure that you have got radiator valves on all of your radiators, more sophisticated controls that mean you're not necessarily heating all zones in your home continuously, that you're able to separately set the temperatures in your bedrooms from living spaces, kitchens and so on differently, through to higher cost improvements, including things like either more efficient boilers or ideally even heat pumps, because heat pumps bring a really big benefit, and they really are a major opportunity to bring down carbon emissions.
And do you think that that simple message for the short term of the behavioural changes are being properly communicated to people? Do you think most people know them already?
No, I really don't. No, and I still think there are huge opportunities in homes, but also in businesses, to save a lot of energy. And our work suggests that most households and most businesses could save getting on for 10%, in some cases more than 10% of their energy bills, by looking at these kind of everyday housekeeping issues, making sure that they're not heating homes warmer than they need to be, making sure they're not heating rooms that are unoccupied, and perhaps thinking about lighting and the most efficient appliances.
OK, Jason Palmer, all very good tips. Thanks very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you.
Now, we're one step closer to being able to make meat in space after cow cells matured at the International Space Station returned to Earth today. The experiment was carried out by Aleph Farms, an Israeli company that specialises in growing meat from cells. They say they want to create a meat that doesn't rely on the weather or the availability of natural resources. And they claim their process results in zero waste and zero emissions, unlike traditional livestock farming, which is responsible for over 30% of global methane emissions. Do stay with us. Coming up, I'll be joined by Bernice Lee from Chatham House and Tom Burke from the E3G think tank, and we're going to be discussing that story. Lab-grown meat, might it be good for the planet? But will humans ever actually take it up? We'll be talking about that in just a moment.
The reality is there's too many streaming services. And if you don't have product or shows that people want to watch on those services, people soon turn off, because it's either get a Netflix subscription or eat in some people's cases. So there's a cost of living situation going on here. And I also think, probably from my view, and I've got the arcade machines behind me, I don't necessarily think that Netflix has made the greatest views on what its programming are. It's trying to broaden its audience at the moment. It's trying to move away from the people like me who love the Adam Sandler films. And that's an important stat, because they invested millions of dollars in Adam Sandler because they knew their viewers were watching Adam Sandler films. We were all questioning why they were doing it, but it was because they have all the statistics about who was watching what and when they were watching it. So they're very savvy at deciding what comes and what goes, perhaps much quicker than other broadcasters, because they're getting all of this instant feedback. That's the cost of living versus the cost of streaming. It's one of the first things that goes, because you don't have a long subscription. The reality is, 5 years ago, I had a Sky subscription, and I may have had one other streaming subscription then. Now, in 2022, I've got at least 5 streaming subscriptions alongside my Sky subscription, and the cost of viewing has not stayed in line. You're now paying an additional amount of money for all of these services. And I think that's the challenge here is none of them have yet reached the sweet spot. Netflix has this incredible habit of increasing the price. When I started watching Netflix, I think I was paying a £5 a month. I think it's now about £15 a month. So there's this increasing cost. And the other thing that's been largely unspoken about with Netflix till now, and they're now speaking about it, is the number of people sharing a password. They say they're now in 220 million homes where they have subscribers, but they've also now admitted they've got 100 million people watching subscriptions twice. So they may have 300 million people watching, but only 200 million people globally are paying. And this is going to be the next big issue. Everybody who's been lending in quotation marks a password to other people are going to find soon they're going to be locked out. Netflix are also moving into video gaming as well, which shows you perhaps that streaming of films and TV content might not be the only place where they want to be.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Now we're getting straight to the climate issues of the day now with Bernice Lee from Chatham House and Tom Burke of E3G, a climate change think tank. Good evening to both of you. Nice to see you both. So, reports abound that the government is set to approve a new coal mine in Cumbria. It will be the first new coal mine in the country in decades, and in theory, it would provide coking coal that's used in steel manufacturing. So, Bernice Lee, unconfirmed reports that this might be about to get the nod. Do you have any sympathy with the arguments for it?
Look, obviously, it says that it will have 500 jobs, and this is important to remember all jobs matter. But at the same time, if we care about jobs, it's pretty clear that the company hasn't really made a commitment yet for the 500 jobs. And as a reporter said earlier on, about a fifth of those wouldn't be local anyways. So therefore, even though we really care about jobs, if we care about the sustainability of the jobs, how long it will last, it is quite important to remind ourselves that if indeed we haven't approved the mine yet, and at the same time, if by 2035, I think Climate Change Committee says that we will unlikely be using much more coking coal. So these are jobs that will last at most for 15 years. So therefore, while it is important to be mindful of the employment benefits, it's not clear that it will actually bring that much local employment benefits on time and for a very sustainable future for any of them either.
And Tom, but what do you make of these arguments that it would help reduce our reliance on importing Russian coal, which obviously is seen as being hugely important since the invasion of Ukraine, but also that it would be greener to produce it domestically rather than transport it from across the world? I mean, it's for the steel industry, which still relies on coal at the moment, doesn't it?
The steel industry does rely on some coal for smelting, that's right. But I think Victoria's report really blew a hole in those arguments. The steel industry in Britain has already moved away from Russian coal. And as Victoria pointed out, most of the coal from the mine will be exported. So you will use an enormous amount of carbon exporting that coal, far more than you would save by just using our domestically ground coal. So it really is a bit of a nonsense, this argument. But much more importantly, as Victoria pointed out in her piece, this government, along with the Canadian government, has put together a really powerful alliance of countries and others to drive coal out of the economy. Now, how on earth can it possibly be credible leading that alliance at the same time as it's opening up a coal mine itself? So it's another kind of example of Britain trying to say to the world, you know, well, one rule for you and another rule completely for us.
Do you think that's right, Bernice, or do you think that some people will say it's just one coal mine, it's not going to make a huge difference to our climate target, so how much does it matter?
Look, I mean, as Tom just said, obviously it is important that we are doing what we preach. Also, at the same time, if we really care about the future of steel, which we should care about because we would need steel, then we should note that there are already countries like Germany and Sweden already have commercial scale green steel production using green hydrogen. So if we're going to spend resources on supporting steel production, it should be for steel for the future and not the one that is about to be sunset.
Well, yes, what do you make of that, Tom? I mean, how advanced are we in this green steel production? How green is it?
Bernice is absolutely right. Our steel production is not very green. It's also, we've got a rather small, by global standards, steel industry. And if what one does is simply let them go on as they are, it'll get left even further behind as the rest of the world moves forward with decarbonize steel production. And that's what you can quite clearly see the markets of the future are going to want. There's going to be a big market for steel. So Bernice is right to say that it's important that we find the way to decarbonize steel. But it's not very good for Britain to give people the illusion that they can go forward in a way that's carbon intensive while the rest of the world is moving in a much more clever and much more viable direction.
And Bernice, do you think that the war in Ukraine has changed a lot in terms of how people view energy? People are looking in terms of a short-term crisis, and certain decisions might be made that wouldn't have been last year when they would have taken the climate considerations that they would be more pressing. Do you think that things have changed, if temporarily?
It is not ever going to be a quick and easy solution, but at the same time, it is certainly strengthened the resolve of those who believe that indeed renewable energy, clean energy are safer, cleaner, and better, and therefore we must get on with it as soon as we can.
Tom, do you think that it's changed our points of view?
It's really been an enormous wake-up call for us. In order to make sure that our energy system is secure, we need to really do all the kind of things Jason was talking about first and foremost, and that's reduce our energy bills and our vulnerability to international commodity prices and our dangers to the climate by doing the things that we can do ourselves in our own homes to make our homes more efficient. But much more importantly than that, we need government to actually invest in energy efficiency as the cheapest and fastest way to drive bills down and deal with climate change. 10 years ago, we were insulating about 2.5 million homes a year. Government changed its policy and we're now insulating less than 20,000. So government policy is moving in the wrong direction. Even actually, as we see from what consumers are doing, they're trying to do their best in order to reduce our vulnerability, both on security grounds and on climate grounds.
I'm just going to speed you up there. We'll talk about insulation another day, I'm sure. We'll come back to that one. But we want to talk about meat now, because we could be one step closer to eating lab-made meat after cow cells matured in space arrived back on Earth today. Now, the company conducting the experiment hopes that this could be a step forward for the space travellers of the future. But it also says that making meat this way could save this planet by cutting emissions. So, Bernice, leaving aside the space aspect for the moment, what do you think? Do you think that lab-grown meat could be the answer to our diet-related environmental issues?
Look, I mean, as we know, there's never one answer, but actually it could be definitely one of the answers, I think. It is already approved, I think, in Singapore from, end of 2020. And I think one of my colleagues described it as a sort of microbrewery version with a bioreactor producing lab-grown meat in Singapore. So I think that if the industry managed to indeed prove that it can deliver what it says on the tin and is transparent about all of the environmental legacy, environmental outcomes, and the social outcomes as well, meaning that it is producing meat in a way that produces less carbon, using less water, using less land, and is in fact going to be able to be produced in such a way that avoids the sort of concentration of power that we know in the meat industry. I think meat is produced literally about like I'm exaggerating, but it's a very small number of producers producing a lot of the world's meat. So if we could actually avoid all the negatives of conventional meat production and indeed provide the nutrition that folks would like, and it's going to be at a cost that is agreeable, and I can see that down the line it could be definitely one of the options.
Tom?
Yeah, I agree with Bernice about this. We are traveling on Spaceship Earth, as it used to be called. It's a closed cycle, much like a spaceship will be. It's just got 8 billion people on it. And if we go on increasing the amount of meat we eat, then we will find it impossible to live on that spaceship. So this is something that's certainly worth exploring. But I think, as Bernice was correct to point out, before you go to scale on a new idea like this, you want to be absolutely sure you've thought of all the possible things that might, when you go to scale, might work really well in a lab, but may not work quite so well when the world's become wholly reliant on them. So we want to be sure before we leap off into this thing that we've fully understood the impact on the environment. Otherwise, all we're doing is changing one problem for another problem. But certainly worth exploring.
Yes, and be fascinating to see what people make of it, whether they fancy the idea of it. That's a whole other issue as well, isn't it? But we'll discuss that another time too. Tom, I can see you've got something to say about it, Tom. We'll find out next time whether you'll be ordering it.
I was just going to say, people often worry about people, but if you think of the way diets have changed in Britain alone over the last 20 years, it's been quite extraordinary how willing people are to change their diet. So I'm not sure that it's the public that's the problem here. It's really the people who manufacture the food and the way in which that's promoted. I suspect, as we've found in a lot of other things, when the public is asked to do its bit, it's on the whole quite willing to do so.
Very interesting. OK, we will leave it there. Tom Burke, Berners-Lee, always good to see you both. Thanks very much indeed. So, coming up on tomorrow's show, I'm going to be joined by Helen Clarkson from the Climate Group and Morgan Gillespie from the World Resources Institute. But that's it from me for now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.